First it was oil pulling, then xylitol, now erythritol. Let's look into erythritol and see how it does for your oral hygiene. So in this video, what I'll do is I'll go over the studies that I looked at that informed my decisions throughout the experiment. I'll also then share my 30-day experiment that I did with erythritol, and at the end of it, I'll give you my observations and conclusions as to if I'll continue using it or not. If you want the quick TLDR, yeah, it works, but it is kind of finicky, so you need to know how to use it in your oral hygiene routine. Let's jump into the studies. When looking at a lot of the studies on erythritol, we actually realized that it's many times being compared to xylitol and sorbitol, and that is because erythritol is also a sugar substitute. Now, how does erythritol work? Well, this is what the studies say. Inhibition in growth and decreased acid production of the principal bacterial species associated with caries development like S mutants. So what this pretty much says is that it limits the amount of growth and acid production of the bacteria in your mouth. The next thing is that it had a decrease in adherence of common streptococcal oral bacteria to tooth surfaces, due in part to a decrease in expression of bacterial genes involved in sugars metabolism, resulting in a reduced production of glucans and fructans. So erythritol, when given to the bacteria in your mouth, made it so that it produced less fructans and glutens, which then made the bacteria less sticky, which meant that the bacteria in your mouth didn't stick to your teeth as easily. They also say that it also had a decrease in vitro biofilm formation and in vivo dental plaque weight. So the erythritol decreases the amount of biofilm that the bacteria has so that it doesn't really stick to your teeth that easily, and also a byproduct of that is that there's less plaque on your teeth. Now this is what a study says when comparing xylitol to erythritol as to how it impacts the growth phases of the bacteria in your mouth. Normally, xylitol-dependent inhibition of bacterial growth has appeared throughout the entire growth phase, whereas erythritol also inhibited, quite distinctively, the growth of some S mutants strains during the later growth phases. So here it's saying that xylitol, it impacts throughout the whole growth phase, while erythritol distinctively triggers and attacks those bacteria at the later growth phases. So they have two different purposes here as to how it attacks and deals with the bacteria in your mouth. So looking at this graph over here, we compare xylitol to erythritol, and we can see that erythritol is quite more efficient compared to xylitol when it comes to surface level bacteria on your teeth. And when comparing the plaque amount that is removed by these sugar substitutes, you can tell that erythritol is way better at removing that plaque in comparison to xylitol and sorbitol. Now, is it okay to consume erythritol? Well, this is what studies say. Erythritol has been consumed by animals and humans for ages, as small quantities of erythritol occur widely in microorganisms, algae, fermented foods, lichens, mushrooms, and many fruits and vegetables, and also animal and human tissues. So it is something that we consume kind of like in our day-to-day basis in all of the foods that we eat, but many times not in such a big quantity or amount, for example, in the experiment that I'll be doing, and that'll come up because that's an issue. Well, what about tooth decay? This is what studies say about that. The non-carcinogenicity of erythritol was first investigated and established in rats in 1990, and soon after in 1996 in humans. And non-carcinogenicity just means that it doesn't cause tooth decay, unlike other things like the white sugar we have in our chocolates and so on. And looking at the amount of plaque that erythritol removes from your mouth, they said that significant higher reduction in fresh plaque weight compared to baseline in subjects consuming erythritol, around 30%, than those consuming xylitol, around 13%. So the amount of plaque that it removes from your teeth is around 3 times as efficient as xylitol. Now looking at this 3-year study, a really interesting finding was found where lower caries development in the erythritol group compared to the sorbitol and xylitol group after a 3-year intervention period that was still visible even 3 years after the intervention was terminated. So after doing the 3-year study, they took a 3-year break and then they looked at the people 2 years after the study, and they found that the people who had been using erythritol in the study still had some lingering benefits from that experiment 3 years ago. And throughout these studies, they have found that both xylitol and sorbitol were commonly used to compare to erythritol, which consistently outperformed both. And I think that's pretty amazing because I use xylitol now after every single meal to kind of feed the bacteria in my mouth to reduce the amount of bacteria that stick to my teeth. And I think it's doing a really good job. And I was like, oh my God, if erythritol is this good, maybe I can just substitute erythritol and put it into my routine instead of xylitol. And throughout my experiment, I found that it might not be as easy as that. Greetings, fancy seeing you here in my mini editing dungeon. Now, I just want to let you know that if you enjoy the content here on this channel, then consider giving a one-time donation, or perhaps even if you're feeling extra generous, maybe even joining as a member so that you can get some extra perks like early access to the videos, exclusive posts, and so on. Now, back to the video. Now, all of these studies say some pretty amazing things about erythritol, right? So how did the experiment go? Let's jump into the 30-day experiment that I did. So at the beginning of the experiment, I kind of just started off doing something very similar to what I did when I was experimenting with xylitol. I took a small teaspoon of erythritol, I put it into my mouth, and I just moved it around for around 5 minutes, and then I swallowed it this time. And after a couple of days of doing this around 2 to 3 times every single day after meals and so on, I felt something pretty bad. My tongue totally got numb and singed by all of the erythritol that I was using. And I'm going to show you a picture of my tongue right now. If you don't like tongue pictures, look away for a hot second, but here's my tongue. And it was extremely sore, and it had felt like I had burnt my tongue. So I quickly realized that I can't just copy paste my past routines of xylitol onto erythritol. I actually need to adapt and use it accordingly. So what I ended up doing was that I decreased the amount of erythritol that I was using. So I was using around 3 to 4 grams every single time I was using it. Now I was just using 1 gram instead. And I also realized that the granularity of the erythritol, it was so fine that it sometimes cut into my mouth and tongue, causing those like numbnesses on my tongue and so on, that I ended up also mixing the erythritol with some water before putting it in my mouth. Another thing that I realized just a couple of days into the experiment was that I shouldn't be swallowing the erythritol. Why is that? It's because I got a pimple. And a pimple might not mean a lot to many people, but I usually don't get pimples. And for me to realize that the only thing that had changed in my routine was this experiment of consuming erythritol, I knew exactly what the cause was, and I stopped consuming erythritol, and I haven't had any pimples since. So instead of swallowing the erythritol after swishing it around in my mouth, I spat it out in the sink. Now, just talking about how my teeth felt like after erythritol, it feels like the duration of smoothness of my teeth just lasts way longer than normal. So many times when I use either oil pulling or xylitol, the teeth kind of get very rough after a couple of hours. But with erythritol, that smoothness that is on your teeth, it lasts for a day or so, a day plus many times, depending on how much I eat or what type of foods that I'm eating. So there's something about the lingering effects of erythritol that I think are superior to xylitol and oil pulling. So after around 2 weeks or so, I actually decreased the frequency to around once per day. And also I changed the duration from around 5 to 6 minutes to like 2 to 3 minutes instead. And this made it so that my tongue didn't feel as sore and kind of tingly from the erythritol, but I still got a lot of the benefits on my teeth from the erythritol. And as I was getting to the end of the 30-day experiment, I realized that the frequency kind of needed to get bumped down again. So instead of using it once per day, maybe once per day or two because sometimes I would feel those benefits of the erythritol go over to the next day, and I didn't really feel like I needed to use erythritol for my oral hygiene needs. So after the 30-day experiment, my mouth felt really good. I felt like my teeth were squeaky clean, erythritol was doing its job, and I had kind of nailed down a frequency, dose, and duration. The frequency, once every 1 or 2 days, the dose, 1 gram mixed with water, and the duration, around 3 minutes or so. And that was the experiment. I felt like I had gotten a really good understanding of erythritol after this experiment, but will I be using it in my oral hygiene routine? And I think that right now, with my current oral hygiene routine, where I use oil pulling in the morning, where I use xylitol throughout the day after meals, I think it has a place maybe at the end of the day as a small supplement before I go to bed. So maybe on my last xylitol usage, I'll add like a 0.5 gram of erythritol to make my mouth extremely nice and smooth and clean before I go to bed. So I don't think it will substitute or replace either xylitol or oil pulling in my day-to-day routine, but I do think that it has a lot of interesting benefits that I kind of want to tap into and learn more about. And I feel like there's a lot of potential with erythritol if it is used properly. So yeah, I will be continue using it, but I'll be continuing to monitor and experiment with the dose, frequency, and duration of the usage of erythritol. And that's it for this video. I hope you've learned something about erythritol. I learned a lot through my experiments and also reading the studies, and I've also just understood that there's so many untapped things in the world that we need to explore and do more research on. Even though there's a lot of studies on erythritol right now, there aren't a lot of products out there that are using the findings of those studies to help your oral hygiene, or there aren't enough studies that can tell you how to use erythritol for your oral hygiene either. If you have any experience with erythritol, or you just want to comment something, well, the comment section is down below. If you like the content, make sure to hit that like button. If you want to see more of this, hit that subscribe button. My name is Paul, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.